So I want to conclude our unit on human population with a short video that covers some issues that have arisen as a result of our studying population. And I don't want you to take my view on these issues, but I want you to think about them for yourself and figure out where you come down on these issues and what the evidence says to you. I will tell you what I think and what I think the evidence says, but I think it's important for you to evaluate it for yourselves and then to continue to evaluate evidence and develop what your opinions are based on data and ethical considerations. So let's go forward. The first is the importance of birth control. Way back in the 50s and 60s, I think people in developed countries naively thought that the world population could be controlled simply by offering birth control to many people in the world. And as we saw in the Barry Commoner article, that just wasn't the case. In contrast, we have countries that are developed where access to birth control is an important part of women's autonomy. And so therefore is an important part of bringing population growth under control in developed countries. And we have also seen that consumption in developed countries is much higher. So bringing population growth under control in those countries is especially important. By itself, the availability of birth control cannot reduce TFR. It's surprising, but when one understands the motivation for having fewer children, it is no longer surprising. So if you understand the fertility theory that we have taught in this course, it is not really surprising. But as I said, it is essential to women's autonomy. And so it is an important component, but by itself cannot do it. In one country that we looked at, total fertility rate dropped from 6 in 1960 to 2.7 in 2010. And researchers afterwards claimed that family planning was responsible for a 55% drop. So I would like you to think about how you might respond to that. I'm sure that the availability of birth control was an important part, as well as government-sponsored family planners who went out and talked to people in the community. But what else do you think must have happened to have that drop occur? So let's review some of the big ideas about population that I think we have uncovered in this unit. First, throughout most of the 20th century, population growth was exponential, but it is showing signs of leveling off now. There has been an unprecedented reduction in total fertility rate in most parts of the world, and this has been driven by real economic development and the decrease in infant mortality rates and the simultaneous empowerment of women. Most nations have undergone or are poised to undergo or are undergoing a demographic transition in which birth rates are dropping rapidly and matching the rather low death rates. And this, of course, doesn't match the Malthusian prediction, which is that people get richer, they should create more babies, and that death rates are increasing with population density, whereas they're actually going down. The continued growth in world population over the next 30 to 70 years is not a result of more babies being born, but a result of children who are young now having a long life expectancy and filling up the upper age classes. In other words, as Hans Rosling said, we have already reached the year of peak child, and so population will start to decline, but we will have an inevitable growth of people who are going to grow into each of the age classes. So what we found out is Malthus was wrong. Not only has human technology kept pace with population growth, but we have seen that affluence doesn't lead to more babies. More food does not equal more babies, as Malthus and Garrett Hardin, who we haven't really talked about much in this course, but he was an ecologist from the 1960s and 70s who famously predicted that more food equals more babies. And these poor nations are just breeding themselves to death. And we've just seen that prediction is incorrect. And we haven't seen that large populations are actually degrading resources. Large, poor populations are degrading resources, or that population is the cause of poverty. In fact, we've seen a lot of things the other way around, that poverty itself causes rapid population growth. Also, the rapid population growth during the 20th century is a legacy of the wealth extraction of colonialism from earlier centuries, And that wealth extraction prevented those countries from undergoing the demographic transition earlier. But nationalization has caused these countries to start to undergo that demographic transition. And now we're going to see in the next 50 years whether capitalism's tendency to accumulate wealth, which it's very good at, will reverse those trends and start to create more poor people. There are some indications that that will happen unless we engage in more democratic economic development. We also saw in this unit that regions can reduce their TFR with low incomes if they increase the sense of engagement, self-determination for people who are living in them, and therefore they can have a low consumption but a life that is fulfilling, where they are engaged in society. And even though we've seen that it's important for the rich nations to set the example of how to become sustainable, how to reduce ecological footprint, these poor nations provide a model to the rich nations of the kinds of things we could do. And that is indeed an irony. Finally, I want to say, I have some final thoughts about poverty by asking this question. Were the American Indians living in poverty before Europeans arrived? The same question could be asked of Native Africans and tribal people all over the world. To me, there's a difference between the lowered standard of living between pre-contact Native American tribes and the poverty of people who now live on the edge, outskirts of modern society anywhere in the world, or especially in America, or of people who are forced off their land and had to work on plantations in colonialism. There's a difference between that low standard of living and the pre-contact standard of living. In the case of Native Americans, they may have had afflictions and life might have been short, but it was thoroughly wrought by self-determination. In other words, those people were not masters to anything else but their own society. Native Americans had access to the resources they needed to live. They lived life on their own terms. In contrast, poor people in American society or in society around the world now often have to live life on terms that make other people rich and maintain them in poverty. So in many places, the poor have no access to materials that would allow them to have a self-determined life. They are born into powerlessness. They are often left behind or ignored or actually exploited by modern society in the fact that they provide cheap labor to create cheap resources by which modern people who are integrated into the economic system of modern society benefit. So in a sense, poverty is not endemic to humans, which I think those of us who grew up in Western countries often think, oh, those poor people have lived in poverty forever, but has been created by colonialism, by plantation and export agriculture, by industrial capitalism. And so I ask you whether you agree with that analysis. I think the evidence is pretty overwhelming that it's true, and it really changes how you look at the poor. It really changes it from, oh, those poor people we didn't have anything to do with, to, oh, those poor people who we had everything to do with and who we are responsible for in a sense. That may remind you of some of the philosophy of early religious thinkers. We've repeatedly seen evidence that disempowerment leads to high birth rates, and that poor people are not in fact acting against their own self-interest when they have more children, but are actually playing the only card, the only self-determination card that they have. So arguing that population causes poverty is a form of blaming the victim, because the poor are made poor not by their own faults, but by social arrangements, by the way the rules of society work. To me, it's imperative that we who are wealthy must look at the causes of disempowerment, see how we benefit by it, and then move forward from there. And one of these causes of disempowerment certainly must be the overaccumulation of wealth. The overaccumulation of wealth to individuals in societies and to societies themselves, which in this case means nation states. When you have a country like the United States consuming 20, 30, 40% of the world's energy with 2, 3, 4, 5% of the world's population, you'll know what I'm talking about. Certainly, we need to lead the way, or we are going to be overwhelmed by people who are going to demand that we lead the way. I now want to throw a little bit of a monkey wrench into the works here by saying, are there too many people? So just because Malthus was wrong, and because population does not cause poverty, or it does not cause hunger, and it doesn't cause many of the major environmental problems that we've seen, it doesn't mean that the current human population is not too high. There may be other reasons that it is too high, but we have to think about them clearly. Human technology is likely to be able to feed even more people than we can now. But how much is enough? We are certainly, for a large vertebrate animal, have a population far larger than, I think, any other vertebrate on the planet. And at our biomass, we certainly do. And with our impact on the environment, we certainly do. And there are millions of other species that have a right to the planet, and they have a co-evolved with us. And I'm going to develop that idea in the next units of the course when we look at ecology and evolution. We are also dependent on those species for our continued survival, although my friend Carl Safina says, don't look at it that way. Look at it, they're dependent on us. In addition, there are many philosophers who have come to realize in the last 100 years that humans need an abundance of wild spaces to be fully human. We evolved in the wild, and we need the wild, no matter how much we think we don't. Interesting idea that perhaps we should explore further. What is the optimum number of people on Earth? We've seen that carrying capacity is fraught with all sorts of issues. But perhaps as a group, as all of society, we can come upon a cultural carrying capacity where we take into account the rights of other species, where we take into account the ability of the planet to provide resources on a sustainable development. And perhaps we can arrive at a population at which humans can live sustainably and allow other species to survive. Not just survive, but thrive. So, I hope you have found the population unit stimulating, and I hope it's encouraged you not to throw up your hands in despair, but to see that the population issue will solve itself if we take care of other issues which allow all people on Earth to live a satisfying, self-actualizing, and self-fulfilling life. And so as we read, one environmental author says, I don't even talk about population, because when we do, we get into draconian ways to solve the population problem. And when we talk about other issues like democracy, economic democracy, allowing people to live self-fulfilled, self-actualized lives, then we solve the population problem at the same time. I hope this will stimulate you to have this conversation with other people, and it will stimulate you to further study these issues as you go on in your scientific and educational careers. Until we begin the next unit, study hard, because we have a test coming up.